Good morning. This is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. It is Wednesday, February 28th, and this is our general session. We will start with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ackerman. Nope,
I'm here. Can you not hear me?
I can now. Great, thank you. Commissioner Cross.
Present.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Oath. Commissioner Ray.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 of 7 commissioners present.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to our meeting. Good to have everybody with us. I would note for the record, we do not have anybody sign up for public comment. I do note that we had two written comments that are part of our portfolio that we've read, one from Patricia Gilbert from City and County of Broomfield, and one from someone identified as CC Carson. Thank you for your written comments. We then move to commissioner comments. I have one comment that I would make so that everyone is aware. On Monday, the Senate Energy and Transportation Committee met to consider the reappointment of Kim Mendoza-Cook to the Orphan Wells Enterprise Board, and Ms. Cook was unanimously agreed upon for reappointment by that committee and is now going to go to the full Senate. So we thank Ms. Mendoza-Cook for the work she does on the Orphan Well Enterprise Board. Other comments from commissioners? All right, seeing none, we move to consent agenda. Does anyone have questions with regard to consent? Seeing no questions, do we have a motion to approve consent?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve consent. Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Today's agenda involves a number of reports, which is kind of different and exciting. So we're first going to hear from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, a presentation on migration corridor data. And I believe we have someone from Colorado Parks and Wildlife with us. Good morning.
Good morning. Should I go ahead and start?
You can start. If you want to introduce yourself and share your screen, go for it.
Great. Okay, let me share my screen. Hopefully everything goes well, and then we'll kick it off. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chair Robbins. My name is Michelle Corden, and I am with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I am the Wildlife Movement Coordinator. Today, I'm here at the request of Commissioner Ackerman to share with you CPW's mule deer and elk migration corridor mapping process. My presentation will take about 25 to 30 minutes. I'll start with a brief purpose and need for mapping migrations in Colorado. Then I'll spend the majority of the time talking about our migration corridor analysis and data output, and I'll end with our next steps and then open it up for questions. So why is there so much focus on migration corridors? In the past, most of our effort was on seasonal ranges such as winter range and summer range, where deer and elk spend large amounts of their time. Migration corridors were known to be important, but it was hard to identify where these corridors actually were in the landscape when we were using VHF tracking collars. As GPS collar use began to increase over the last 20 years, biologists were able to see and track migration and movement corridors as they literally started to take shape and appear on their screens. In addition, with the increased human disturbance on the landscape, corridors were getting disrupted and fragmented and lost. It was becoming apparent that without identifying and protecting migration corridors, that animals would not be able to move between seasonal ranges that are critical to their survival, especially in the West. In many areas of Colorado, summer ranges occur at higher elevations on public land, and winter ranges found at lower elevation on BLM and private lands. Migration corridors or transitional range bridge the gap between these seasonal ranges that can be miles apart. The importance of migration corridors is highlighted by the interest at both federal and state levels, with increased policy and funding. Two examples are the 2018 Department of Interior Secretarial Order 3362 and the 2019 Governor's Executive Order on Big Game Winter Range and Migration Corridors in Colorado. In 2021, CPW recognized the importance of migration corridors and connectivity when they created a position dedicated to studying and analyzing wildlife movement and connectivity across the state. This is my position as the Wildlife Movement Coordinator. One of my first tasks was to coordinate the gathering of CPW's GPS color data from our deer, elk, pronghorn, and bighorn sheep studies for CPW's first statewide migration analysis. Before I go into details on our migration analysis, I would first like to highlight a few of CPW's data needs for mapping mule deer and elk migration corridors. They include, but aren't limited to, land use planning efforts. Many of our local municipalities around the state use our species maps for development planning and conservation efforts. Also, our federal partners use our data, such as with our current BLM RMPA, or with the current BLM RMPA, and CDOT uses our migration data to help identify priority wildlife crossing locations. There's also an increased focus across the Western states. An example is the USGS Ungulate Mapping Team, which Colorado is a participant along with 10 other Western states. And then we also have many internal program needs, such as the development of our state habitat conservation and connectivity plan. Also for programs such as HPP, when they're working to do fence modifications to help remove barrier and obstacles to wildlife movement, and our wildlife habitat protection program to identify areas of importance for land protection. In addition, mapping of our migrations have helped to identify some data gaps within CPW. Also, there are currently numerous funding opportunities for habitat work, for removing barriers and doing land protection work associated with migration corridors, which makes it important for us to have migration corridors identified and mapped as a state agency. And lastly, also our needs for providing information to you in the form of ECMC 1200 series wildlife regulations. Now I'd like to provide detail on our current mule deer and elk GPS color analysis that we are using to identify and map migration corridors. When I started in the fall of 2021, one of the first tasks I knew that was needed was to gather all of our GPS color data to perform a migration corridor analysis. I was extremely fortunate to have a CPW biologist who was already working with a master's student at Western Colorado University who needed to generate migration corridors for her thesis work. With their help, we were able to gather GPS color data from around the state from our terrestrial biologists to complete our first statewide migration analysis. You can see here that we compiled almost 5 million location points from GPS tracking collars. I want to highlight that the data analysis took place in the spring and summer of 2022. Therefore, what I'm going to show you today does not include data collected since early 2022, and we have not repeated our analysis process since then, although we are in the process of updating it. So what we have here is a map showing the areas where we have mule deer GPS color data, shown in the yellow and white. The numbers represent the data analysis unit, or DAU, used by CPW for population management. The yellow highlighted areas do have GPS coloring studies that are ongoing. However, this data was not included in our 2022 analysis, and we're currently working through these data sets. In total, through spring of 2022, CPW collected over 2 million GPS data locations for mule deer and had 1,020 mule deer make migrations that were collared. I want to note that the 2022 analysis also did not include any CPW research data, except in the Piceance Basin, which is in the lower section of D7, where we were able to use Chuck Anderson's data. GPS coloring projects for deer on average started around 2013, although D30 had a project in collaboration with Southern Utes that started back in 2004 and is still ongoing today. And D4 GPS coloring study didn't start until spring of 2021. So the start dates for many of our GPS coloring projects vary depending on the unit. It is also very important to note that only 14 of the 52 mule deer data analysis units have had GPS coloring projects. Again, this is shown in the yellow and the white where we have the data. The gray areas show where we do not have GPS coloring projects, at least at the time of the 2022 analysis. There are also many areas around the state where CPW staff knowledge and expertise is vital to identify and map corridors because we do not have coloring projects in all of the herds. It's also not realistic to think that we can color individuals in all herds across the state. On this slide, I wanted to point out that several of the areas where we have GPS color data is because they are part of a long-term mule deer survival study. These studies, highlighted in blue, started using VHF collars as far back as 1997 and started transitioning to GPS collars around 2014 as animals died and they needed to replace the sampled individuals. By 2025, all collars should be transitioned in these areas to GPS. Although this study is designed for mule deer survival, we are able to use the data to map migration corridors. I wanted to note that the older style VHF collars we had to locate the animal signal from the ground or from the air to get location points. It was difficult and expensive to get accurate locations, and we were lucky to get a location a week, but more likely it was much less than that. Now with GPS collars, the data can be collected multiple times a day and the locations are downloaded directly to the biologist's computer. This map shows the distribution and location of elk GPS collar studies. At the time of the 2022 analysis, we had GPS collars in 14 of the 43 DAUs, with study start dates ranging from 2012 through 2022. We analyzed over 1.7 million data locations and had 750 elk migrate. Again, the gray areas show where we do not have GPS collared elk at the time of the analysis, and yellow areas are ongoing research areas with GPS collars, which were not included at this time. We also gathered all of our bighorn sheep and limited pronghorn data. We have a good representation and distribution of bighorn sheep data, but the pronghorn data is very limited. You can see Middle Park, or A37 unit, which is in the middle of the state. This does have a robust sample, and we are mapping migration corridors in this herd. CPW has also started a Northeast pronghorn and mule deer GPS collaring study, not to mention a couple other possible GPS mule deer projects in the state and elk survival studies that are coming online. For today, we will only be talking about mule deer and elk data and data collected prior to 2022. In 2022, shortly after I started this position, I formed an internal group to develop definitions associated with migrations. We created two definitions: migration range and migration corridors. Migration range is used to describe where any one or more animals have migrated. Think of this like the CPW species activity maps winter range layer. It's a broad, more general area. The definition is an area suitable for use by migrating animals to move between seasonal ranges, regardless of the number of individuals. Whereas a migration corridor is being used to identify an area of higher concentration of use than the surrounding migration range. Think of this like our severe winter range or winter concentration areas that CPW maps for deer and elk that are typically within the broader winter range. Migration corridor is defined as a specific geographic area that facilitates movement between seasonal ranges and receives higher use than the surrounding landscape relative to herd or population use, and loss of which would disrupt migration. So now we're ready to discuss, so we've already discussed kind of our GPS data distribution. And now I'll give a quick review of our methodology that CPW used to identify migration range and migration corridors from our GPS collar data for mule deer and elk. We used a Brownian bridge movement model analysis. A Brownian bridge movement model creates a heat map or utilization distribution for each animal and for each migration. It estimates the expected movement path between points using time, distance, and speed and location. The individual maps are then stacked to get a herd level migration map. It's important to note that the concentration areas or hotspots vary in the number of individuals represented in each herd. This depends on the number of migrating animals, the number and distribution of the captured and colored individuals, and the route taken. We conducted our initial analysis at the DAU or Data Analysis Unit, combining all colored animal migrations for each DAU. To start, we have all the GPS point locations from the GPS collars for each animal. We have to determine which points represent spring and fall migrations, which I'll go over on my next slide. I want to emphasize that this process only uses migration points to generate the migration output layer. So here on this map, that would be the blue and red points representing spring and fall migrations. The gray points are winter and summer locations. I also want to point out that you can see overlap between all the different colors. This is because animals have different winter and summer ranges, and that one animal's winter range may be another animal's migration range. Think of this like when you were driving home. You pass many other houses on your way. You don't just stop at the first house you see to get to your place. So how does a Brownian bridge migration analysis generate the expectant path of an animal? For Brownian bridge movement models use a net square displacement curve to select points associated with each migration. For each, which is shown in the top right. For each individual, we have to review the point data associated with that individual for each year in each migration season. Manually, we identify the start and end dates of all migrations. Typically, these are spring and fall migrations, although animals can make additional summer and winter movements. Here is an example of the net square displacement curve generated by the migration mapper software. The graph changes as the distance from your start date or winter location shown on the tails of the graph changes. The distance increases as animals move towards its summer range as highlighted in the purplish blue color on the graph. The distance from your start location stabilizes when the animal is on summer range as shown at the top of the graph, and then decreases as it approaches back to winter range, highlighted red on the graph. The blue and red lines that are highlighted are the migration period. As an example, what this looks like is on the ground is shown here in the map insert. This is an actual movement shown in our data. You can see where the animal's winter or gray points on the left side of the screen are, and the summer points or green points are on the right side. The blue and red points highlight spring and fall migrations for one individual. To get migration corridors for the DAU or Data Analysis Unit sampled or herd process, this process is repeated for each individual animal. Although Brownian bridge movement models, they are modeling process, it is using actual data points to create the heat map. It's not using other environmental variables or taking locations and extrapolating out to another area. For example, the Brownian bridge model does not take data by Craig to generate migration corridors by Salida. Okay, so that was the nitty-gritty on kind of the migration analysis, and now we'll look at some of the output. Remember, I mentioned that we created two data layers. We created a migration range and migration corridors. The migration range is the broader layer where one or more animal migrated. This is what we are seeing here. This is the overall footprint of our Brownian bridge migration analysis. You might be wondering why up in the northwest corner, the migration range and area looks so solid in color. And this is because when we zoom in on the data in the Northwest region, we not only have a large number of GPS collared mule deer in the Northwest portion of the state, But there's also a lot of overlap between our data analysis units where we've collared animals between our D7 and our D2 deer. So you can see a lot of our D7 animals make migrations up into D2. We also have Chuck Anderson's work in the southern portion of D7 in the Piceance Basin. These different shades of blue and gray demonstrate the overlap you can see between the D7 mule deer and D2 that are underneath the D2 layer. So you just see how it gets kind of complicated, and it also starts to fill in a lot of the area. Again, what we're looking at here is the migration range data. So this is where any one or more GPS collar animal migrated as generated by the Brownian Bridge movement analysis. It's also important to remind you that we are looking at movements of a subset of our herds. This is only showing data for animals that we had GPS collared individuals. Staying in the Northwest, I've overlaid migration corridors or higher concentration use of migration areas by GPS collared mule deer in the brown on top of the migration range I was showing you earlier in blue. You can see the corridors that we identified based on high concentration of use or higher concentration of use. As a reminder, through spring of 2022, we had collected over 2 million data points from over 1,000 mule deer that made migrations. What we don't know is when we collect migration data for one animal is how many animals does that represent on the ground. I also want to point out that the migration range map in blue does demonstrate more of a sheet flow type migration we have in Colorado, especially in areas where we don't have restrictions to movement. Before moving on to elk, I want to take a moment to discuss how CPW is addressing this gray area or areas where we do not have GPS collars. It's not reasonable or feasible to think that we will be able to have all deer and elk herds fitted with GPS collars. Therefore, it is pertinent for us to continue to identify and map migration corridors using our staff expert knowledge. Our best available data is a combination of data-driven migration corridor mapping and CPW staff knowledge. This map is showing the migration corridors from the Brownian Bridge analysis in gray. So it's the corridors, not the range, the migration corridors under the proposed HPH mule deer migration corridors in blue. In 2023, we met with staff to review the Brownian Bridge maps for migration corridors. You can see some areas where the gray or the Brownian Bridge data were not added based on staff review and input. In other areas, you can see, see more expert mapped migration areas were included. In the Northwest, D2 and D7, the wildlife biologists had additional migration data from 2022 through 2023 that they used to append the Brownian Bridge maps for the proposed HPH layer. CPW will continue to use a hybrid approach to mapping our mule deer and elk migration corridors in order to create and have a statewide migration corridor layer. This map shows the proposed HPH migration corridors in blue overlaid with the Brownian Bridge migration range layer. Again, the range layer is where we have any one or more animal that migrated and we generated a Brownian Bridge migration map for, to show you how we focused on the concentration use areas to identify migration corridors in the proposed HPH layer. Okay, only a few more slides to go. I want to show you just a couple of slides related to elk migration. As a reminder, for elk at the time of the 2022 analysis, the coloring project start dates ranged from 2012 through early 2022, and we analyzed over 1.7 million data locations from 750 elk that had made migrations. This map shows the elk migration range in green and migration corridors in blue. Again, note that the gray space on the map is where we do not have GPS collars. I want to mention that for all these maps, the sample results also depends on the distribution of colors and the concentration of use within each migration corridor. In areas where you see green or migrating range bleeding over into the gray, this is from animals collared in neighboring sample units that are making cross-boundary movements. Here I am showing the proposed HPH elk migration corridors in pink over the green migration range. The pink migration corridors within the gray areas are where we do not have colored projects, and we are using staff expert knowledge to map corridors to produce a statewide migration corridor. Again, the Northwest biologists, for example, had more current GPS data points than our 2022 analysis. And so they were using some data to amend the Brownian Bridge maps in the recommended or proposed HPH migration corridors. So this is our last map. This map shows the proposed HPH elk and mule deer corridors. They're underneath, and they're shown in the purple and the green, and they're underneath the existing HPH 1202D series wildlife data. And I produced this map to show you kind of where those changes that are associated with deer and elk migration corridors would be. You can see wherever the green and the purple bleeds through the gray is where there would be proposed changes to the 1202D series in relation to the migration corridor data that we talked about today. So to wrap this up, in 2022, this was our first iteration of conducting a statewide migration corridor analysis. It was a big lift, and we were very fortunate to have a graduate student dedicated to the data gathering, cleaning, and analysis. We are in the process of repeating this analysis with data collected since 2022. My goal is to have it completed by the end of this year. Fingers crossed, because we don't have a graduate student at this time, so I'm doing a lot of the data cleaning and processing. Regardless of the migration corridor analysis methodology, we will continue to review data-derived migration corridor layers with field staff to get field level review and edits. In order to create a statewide migration corridor layer, we need to maintain a hybrid approach and continue to use staff expert knowledge, especially in areas where we lack GPS color data. I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. At this time, commissioners, we have an opportunity for questions. Might call upon Commissioner Ackerman if he would like to lead off with regard to questions, given his seat on our commission.
I sure would. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And Ms. Gordon, if you could kill that presentation, then we'll be able to see each other. I know you can't see, but it's still up on our screens.
Sure, let me, sorry. You would think I would know how to use this, but there we go.
There you go.
You would think we all would by now. Thank you so much, Ms. Gordon, and for your presentation. It's very nice to see you. This is a great illustration of just one aspect of the exceptional work done by CPW, and it does a good job of demonstrating why we rely so strongly on CPW as the state's expert on wildlife. I had a number of, I guess, questions, a few observations. I wanted to say it's very nice to see an elk collaring effort taking place in the Raton Basin. Wanted to thank you for that effort. And I also appreciated that you demonstrated that we supplement the collaring efforts through staff expert analysis in certain locations, as you noted. Can you discuss a little bit what drives the criteria for selection of collaring projects?
Yeah, I was, yes, thank you. I was getting at that a little bit with the slide on the mule deer survival study areas. So for our mule deer data, a lot of our data is coming from those 5 survival study areas up in the Northwest, Middle Park, Gunnison, Uncompahgre, and over by Salida. And then in addition to that, we are conducting other GPS collaring projects as the need arises. We are doing some additional movement migration data studies that are proposed around State Bridge and also down in the San Juans. So the purpose and need really varies, kind of one based on herd conditions, herd sizes. You know, for the Northwest, we are keeping track of those larger herds. And then the survival studies that have been going on since the early 90s, you know, we're looking at survival and cause-specific mortality in those herds. So there are many different reasons that we're putting collars out in different areas for deer and for elk. I'm not sure that I have one defined answer to that. I mean, I don't know if Taylor has anything to add, but we're doing research study that's looking at recreation and elk interactions. And so, you know, we have collar data that'll be coming on for elk in some of those research areas. So it changes over the years, but the one thing that is consistent is in those survival study areas. And we are kicking off elk survival studies at this point. And I see that being similar to our mule deer survival study areas, where it's going to be long-term, that we can track these populations and gather data. I don't know if I accurately answered your question or not.
Yes, that's a great answer. Thank you so much. It's clear that wildlife are impacted by all human activity. And you know, in reality, we could collar all the animals and have different reasons for collaring each of them from month to month and year to year. And appreciate your response there. And speaking of which, you did mention that it's not realistic to gather collaring data in all DAUs. Can you talk about what limits the magnitude of the collaring efforts of CPW?
Probably, you know, majority is time and money. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but we spend, you know, millions of dollars by, you know, you have to capture these animals with helicopters. The GPS collars give us great data. You do have the collars are very expensive. They're thousands of dollars in cost. The cost changes depending. The more data you want to collect per day, the higher the cost, because you have to pay for that data and the data download. You don't have to have a tech on the ground as much doing the tracking, but it kind of becomes a wash with the data cost. So money is obviously one large consideration. And then the time, as I showed, I mean, just what we've collected since 2022. And I will say that, you know, probably starting now forward, we're done with VHF collars. The amount of data that we're going to be collecting through GPS collars is going to be staggering. Just trying to manage millions of data points coming in all the time is going to cost money also to manage and do any sort of additional analysis. The other thing is, you know, putting out these collars, we have to get access to do a lot of capturing from landowners and from our federal partners. It's just, you know, it's not something that we can do everywhere for all herds. Also, your sample size, how many animals you capture, the larger your herd, you would want to collect more data for larger herds. And so kind of just collecting that volume of data can be cost prohibitive and time prohibitive.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a fiscal impact and so labor intensive that it is very difficult. And even beyond, you know, this discussion and even beyond wildlife, it demonstrates the scientific importance of extrapolation, of modeled extrapolation of data. And you can extrapolate data beyond and should extrapolate data beyond its gather points. And I note that that's generally not the case in these studies, that you're clearly mapping the data itself that was gathered, but it does illustrate the importance of extrapolation of data. So if you look at Wyoming, for example, or maybe some other states, you see migration corridor maps that show great big long migration superhighways, very clearly defined. when you looked at some of your slides, specifically in the Northwest, the maps kind of look, as you noted, more like, big spaghetti bowls or blobs. Can you talk a little bit about why that's the case in Colorado?
Yeah. One thing is, I believe it relates to sample size is one thing. So in the Northwest, we have 300 to 400 individuals collared, mule deer collared in those units. When you might have noticed maybe over by Fort Collins, the corridors looked a little bit more, even the range map looked a little bit more like what you are used to seeing in Wyoming, where it's a more linear corridor. That's because that's a very small sample size. In fact, up in D4, we didn't even map corridors. We only did the range map because we didn't feel like the sample size was large enough to capture that. So if you only have 20 or 30 animals maybe collared, especially depending on how those animals disperse out and how, where the distribution is, you can get a more linear corridor. But in a lot of areas in the state, we do have large sample sizes, and we are sampling across a data analysis unit. We're not just putting all of our data into all of our collaring into one subherd, one small specific group. So we're not going out and capturing 20, 30 animals on, 5,000 acres. We're capturing many animals across a large DAU, and then they disperse out. And then we keep adding to that and stacking and stacking. And so the more you stack, you get this distribution of collars, and then also you start to see that a little bit of concentration. So by mapping our corridors, we're hoping to kind of identify those hot spots. And then, as I also alluded to, in Colorado, going back to a lot of Chuck Anderson's work and some of the work that Andy Holland, the biologists, have done, we also have identified in Colorado that we do have more of this sheep flow migration. So the animals disperse across the landscape. It's similar to habitat in Wyoming, but you think about it in the Northwest, there's not a lot of physical barriers or restriction with human development, urbanization, even highways are limited, right? So the animals kind of spread out across the landscape. And again, I think that was demonstrated too, where we have a lot of overlap between our migration corridors for one animal and seasonal uses for another. So one animal migrates through another animal's winter range, and so we get a lot of overlap of uses also, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you, and I appreciate that. It certainly demonstrates that, as we talk about often, that much of Colorado is wildlife habitat, and they do find many places to use. How often do you mentioned you got a refresh coming? Do you have kind of a regular schedule that you intend to refresh the data for migration corridors?
At this time, we do not have like a defined schedule. The undertaking to gather this data is enormous. Currently, all of our data is dispersed across the state with all the different biologists that collect the data. So in order to get the data, I make a request. It comes in, the data has to be cleaned, standardized. And then, as I mentioned, for every individual and for every migration, we have to manually look at that, and we have to assign through migration mapper software a start and end date, and then run the analysis, and then go back through and do the data cleaning and all of that. So we do not have a set schedule. I really want to see us have this updated at the end of 2024 and be able to add to our past analysis. And then the other thing that'll be, when the first analysis occurred, I was new to this position, and so I had a lot happening. I'm hoping this year I can get a better understanding of that process, and then how we merge the data with our past years. And then we also have a new spatial ecologist. So as he gets on board, we can also start looking and looking at other things within the data that we have and start to really maximize our output. I don't think this will be an annual event. I don't see how that's possible. I don't know at some point if we'll get into a more set schedule. At this point, we're just trying to get through a process for this next iteration and see how it goes. So we don't really have a plan beyond this year.
Understood. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, one more question, and then I'll yield to the other commissioners. But I am sure that you recall that we had discussions about migration pinch points during the Senate Bill 181 discussion, and have kind of a placeholder for a future rulemaking that would incorporate migration pinch points into the high priority habitat layers that that ECMC recognizes as we do our work. I know we'll have further discussion about how those migration pinch points were developed, but just to be clear, everything that you showed us on the map is a migration corridor, not necessarily a pinch point. Could you or Mr. Elm talk about just a little bit briefly, give us a preview a little bit of how you took that data and determined where the migration pinch points were, if you've finished that up yet?
Yeah, thank you. The pinch points that we have identified that are currently in review did not use this data specifically. It used the data in the sense that the biologist who identified, or staff that identified the pinch points, are the ones that collect this data. And so they know, based on their experience, using that data, where the pinch points are. But we did not specifically use this migration analysis to identify those. They may have been identified through the biologists doing their own analysis. In the future, we may be using the data that we've collected here to identify pinch points, but the pinch points that are currently mapped are through, expert knowledge and using GPS collar data, but at a very local level. And then the other pinch points are all of the highway underpasses and overpasses.
Gotcha. Thank you. So that was a bit of a convergent effort that may be informed in the future by the work you're doing. And just wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation. Very, very knowledgeable and very informative for us. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll yield there.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ackerman. Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Cowardin.
Cowardin, yes, that's fine.
Thank you. So, one question I have is, who's Chuck?
Oh, thank you for the question. Sorry. Yes, Chuck Anderson is a researcher with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and he conducted a long-term mule deer peon study, GPS collaring. Sorry. So he's a CPW researcher.
Sounds like he's good at his work. I'm wondering if how animals migrate tell us things about other animals. So do multiple animals use the highway, so to speak? So if you know that the mule deer are using it, or the elk, are pronghorn also using it, or coyotes? Just curious if it tells us about other creatures and what they might be doing too.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's one of those, it depends, right? For the most part, species are making these movements independent of other species. I think when we start talking about pinch points and looking at this data, one thing we might do is overlay our deer and elk data and see if we have an area where we're getting overlap. And then those areas would be maybe of higher priority. Now, I know I'm here locally in Middle Park and Hot Sulphur, and I know that there's an area between Hot Sulphur and Granby where, based on our data and expert knowledge, we know that those animals have to migrate from their winter range west of Hot Sulphur, going east towards Granby to get to the Front Range. And there's a very narrow corridor between the highway and higher elevation that kind of impedes movement in the winter and spring, where elk deer, and pronghorn all pass through. So in some areas you might have an area, but it's not a path, you know, it's a width, it's a swath area that they go west to east. And so in some areas, we're going to be able to identify those. But again, I think getting to Brett's point, in some ways, you know, Wyoming's done a great job of like telling this migration story, but they really simplified it. By just showing these linear paths. People think that there's literally a trail out there that these animals are walking on, and that's the corridor. And that's not the case. These corridors can be very wide as these animals move, and they're selecting based on conditions for that year, that type of thing. So we have to think broader than just a linear path when we're thinking about corridors. And so just keep that in mind. Yeah, appreciate it.
No, that's
Thank you very
helpful.
much.
I think what you're saying though too is the pinch points are more important because the pinch points tell us there's a minimal space for everybody to get from point A to point B. And that's why it's important for us to protect them. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you saying?
Yeah, the pinch points can be those things that if they are severed, they will restrict and change or stop a migration through an area. And those pinch points could be from natural features on the landscape, or they could be a human disturbance or a combination of both.
Thanks. This was very informative today.
Thank you. Other questions, Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the presentation. That was good information, and I have a few questions, and I'll start with just a silly question because I'm still just trying to scratch my head on, you know, how the GPS collars work, and so these GPS collars, I assume that they're like solar powered batteries and that they're able to project, you know, information on a certain basis. But what's the longevity of those? Like, when do they need to be replaced, and you know, how does that work?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Messner, for that question. Yeah, most of these are not solar based. Sometimes on sage grouse, we do put little solar backpacks on to keep, because the batteries are so small. For deer and elk, they're very large batteries, and the longevity of the collar depends on how many data points you want to download. The more data points you want to gather, the more times that collar has to turn on to connect to the satellite and then download the data. So for our survival studies, we're concerned about mortality. And so we collect 2 points a day for our survival studies. Those collars may last 3 to 4 years. The old VHF collars, which we had to go out and they didn't transmit, you know, to a satellite, they might last 6 years, 7 years even. So we do lose longevity with the GPS collars. If you want to collect data every hour, you're probably going to take that collar life down below 3 years, maybe 2 years, which is great. But then, you know, then you have to change then that animal, then the collar dies, right? And they have to put out another collar. So it's really dependent on your data download and what you're requiring of that GPS collar data. So in some areas, if we are focusing on doing a movement GPS collaring study, we may set that GPS collar to get data every 2 hours. You can set it to get 2 hours during the spring and fall migrations. And then maybe when they're on summer winter range, you only get 1 or 2 locations a day. So it all depends. And then it also costs more money. The more times you want that GPS collar to take a point, you have to pay for that. So that ties into Commissioner Ackerman's question earlier.
Sure. No, thanks for answering that question. You know, I wonder, and you've talked a little bit about, you know, how this information will be utilized in different determinations. And, you know, One is obviously the development or evolution of different high priority habitats. But when we're looking at specific migratory corridor high priority habitats, what are I mean, does this data teach you anything about what potential impacts affect the migratory corridor high priority habitat areas, you know, whether that's road habitat fragmentation or whether that's you know, certain, you know, human activities, or whether that's recreation or things like that? Is there information that could be extrapolated around what impacts are most impactful to these migratory corridors?
Yeah, yes, thank you for that question. I don't know about most impactful, but I think, you know, one example is the recreation elk GPS collaring study that our researcher Nathaniel Rail is doing currently, right? They have GPS collars on, they have recreational activities, they're seeing how those two interact. Even on Vail Pass years ago, they had GPS collared links and they put GPS units in backpacks of recreation users and then overlaid the time analysis between those point locations. So there's a lot you can do with this. As we start to get a more process and get more comfortable with all this data, we can start digging into that. We can start looking not at these swaths of movements by the Brownian Bridge, but we can also start digging into the data for individuals and seeing how they bump up against a highway, or how they're going around maybe a new housing development that went in, type of thing. And the one thing is, you know, we do have data going back to 2014 or later, but the sample sizes have been slowly increasing. So back in 2014, we maybe, I don't know how many animals, right? We had a smaller subset of animals with GPS collars. We are transitioning to all GPS collars now. So from this point forward, we're going to have very large sample sizes. We can start looking at how they are interacting with features on the landscape. That's going to help us identify where do we need to do conservation easements? Where do we need to do wildlife crossing projects? Where do we have sheep fence that maybe are pronghorn or bumping up against and going miles to get around sheep fence? What can we do with that fence to make it more permeable? We don't have to remove it, but what can we do to make it more permeable? So these are all things that we're going to start looking at with our data as we move forward. And as time goes on, with most things, the cost should decrease. The cost, you know, with these collars should start to decrease, the data download cost should decrease, and then we can start increasing the number of points that we're getting per day to answer some of these finer scale movements. Right now, when you have 12 hours between points, an animal could move, a deer or elk in 12 hours can move many miles. We can't just draw a straight line, because we know that animal didn't go straight line between two 12-hour points. And so that's why we have to use the Brownian Bridge models to say, based on speed and distance, doesn't look at habitat variables, where could that animal have gone in that 12 hours? If you have 2 hours, it's a little bit different, right? We can start really looking at fine scale things happening. But we're not quite there yet at some of our data layer, but we're building that now.
Right. Maybe at some point we could just put one of those Apple tabs on them, right? And then they can provide all kinds of information. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like what type of habitat is being utilized in these migratory corridors. Is it riparian corridors? Is it, I mean, I guess it depends on where they're going and what they're trying to access, but you know, there was a lot of conversation about riparian corridors and being, you know, multi-species migratory corridors during the mission change rulemaking, and that some of this, you know, additional studies and information would help inform, you know, whether or not some of our rules were adequate for addressing riparian corridors. And so does this give you any insight on the utilization of riparian corridors from a migratory perspective, at least for these species?
Thank you for that question. I think, you know, you saw on our maps the lack of data that we have for GPS collars on the Eastern Plains, even for pronghorn, right? Most of our data has been for deer and elk on the Western slope. So I think when you're talking about the importance of riparian corridors for movement or migration of animals on the Eastern Plains, I do believe that is true, even though we don't have the supporting data. So I think as we start to put GPS collars out on the Eastern Plains for pronghorn and even for deer, I think we're going to start to see that, you know, it's a much drier landscape than the mountains in the West. And so what happens on the Western slope and what happens on the Eastern Plain with animal movements is very different. And so we need to start building those data sets on the Eastern Plains. Again, I think it really emphasizes the importance of our staff knowledge, because like I said, we're not going to ever have collars everywhere. And so just a combination of the two. So yes, I think on the Eastern Plains, that's very important. On the Western slope, they're moving more from BLM lands all the way up to the forest. You have animals by Craig going all the way to rabbit ears, right? And so in that type of system, they're probably not just moving through riparian corridors, because it's a very different landscape. On the Eastern Plains, they're going to be tied more to that water feature for cover and for water. On the Western slope, they have a lot more options for cover and for water.
Right. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the presentation.
Further questions? All right, I'm not seeing further questions. Thank you again for the presentation to us today. It has been very informative, and the answers to the questions have added value to that.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. I really enjoyed presenting to you, and please let me know if I can come back and talk more about this. I enjoyed sharing the information, and so just reach out if you have any additional questions. And thank you again for the invite.
Great. All right, commissioners, before we move to our next presentation, why don't we take a short break? It is 9:57. Let's return at 10:07, and then we will hear from the greenhouse gas roadmap presentation. All right, we are going to get going again. We now have a greenhouse gas roadmap presentation, and this is from one of our own, Commissioner Aaron Ray. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to share my screen. Just give me a moment here. All right, can you all see those slides?
We can.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and fellow commissioners. I'll note that I'm presenting to you today in my capacity as Assistant Director for Energy Innovation in the Executive Director's Office at DNR, where I was involved in representing DNR in the process of updating the state's greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. And I'd first like to acknowledge the leadership of the Colorado Energy Office and the hard work of state agency staff at ECMC, at CDPHE, at CEO, and at many other state agencies to update the state's greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. I'd also like to recognize the substantive input of hundreds of stakeholders, both individuals and groups, that participated in the process of updating that roadmap. So the impetus for the development of the state's roadmap is our obligation to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets set by the state legislature. Those targets were first set in 2019 and updated in 2023. And the state has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So we have quite a task before us. In order to meet those targets, the state developed the first roadmap in 2021. Since then, the state has been implementing the near-term actions identified in that first roadmap. And as of this year, 95% of the initial near-term actions identified in the first roadmap are either underway or completed. So we've made good progress on the work that we set for ourselves a couple of years ago. Given that we've implemented many of those initial near-term actions, and as the state updated our greenhouse gas reduction targets last year, we began to develop an update to the roadmap in 2023. That work has culminated in the release of the new roadmap earlier this week, announced by the governor on Monday. And among the work that was done under the previous roadmap, the state has made some major accomplishments to help get us on a path to reduce our emissions. The state's created binding plans for utilities to reduce emissions from electricity generation. The state's invested heavily in the transition to electric vehicles. And thanks to the work of this commission and others, the state has adopted rules to reduce emissions from oil and gas operations, among many other actions. So the process of developing an updated roadmap included robust stakeholder engagement, including a number of in-person meetings in every region of the state, numerous virtual meetings with stakeholder groups and the general public, and we received extensive written comment. As I mentioned, just on Monday, the state released the updated roadmap, and there's a link on this slide to the updated roadmap. You can also find that document on the website of the Colorado Energy Office, and I encourage folks to take a look at that report. The updated roadmap includes a new set of 49 near-term actions that are intended to help the state meet our updated greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Those new near-term actions include emissions reduction measures in every sector, including utilities, transportation, buildings, oil and gas, industry and agriculture, among others. And as part of updating the roadmap and identifying these new near-term actions, the state contracted with RMI to model the emissions reductions that we can expect from these near-term actions. And so I want to share with you one figure from the roadmap that helps put this work in context. As you can see in this figure, we can compare projected greenhouse gas emissions reductions to what we call a business as usual scenario, which reflects what would have happened if the state had not made major changes in policy and new investments to reduce emissions since 2020. So that business as usual scenario is the light blue line indicated in this figure. And you can see that we've reduced emissions since 2005 levels by 2020. That's the dotted historical line under the business as usual scenario. So without additional work starting in 2020, the state would have reduced emissions a bit further. But then you can see that emissions reductions essentially flatline after 2030 under the business as usual scenario, which does not get us to our targets. And so RMI also developed a baseline trajectory, which reflects the actions taken since the release of the 2021 roadmap. So from the business as usual scenario, if you incorporate the work that has been done with the release of the first roadmap, as well, I'll note, as the impacts of recent federal regulation, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, you can see that under the baseline scenario, we achieve significant emissions reductions, and that's the yellow line on this figure. But you can see that under that baseline scenario, we don't get to the statutory reduction targets. Those are the stars that you see in this figure. And so without any new rules or laws beyond what's already underway as of 2023, we're projected to be about 80% of the way to meeting the statutory goal of a 50% emissions reduction in 2030. That's good. So the yellow line gets us close, but it doesn't get us to that statutory target for 2030. And so the goal of this roadmap update was to identify additional actions that can help the state meet those statutory targets. And so the last line here, the green line, represents the emissions projected based on the new near-term actions included in the roadmap. And you can see that the implementation of these new near-term actions, we get quite a bit closer to meeting that 2030 target. So you can see the work in this updated roadmap reflects the change from the yellow baseline scenario to the green scenario, which includes implementing the near-term actions. Based on RMI's projections, if we implement everything in this new roadmap, we can expect to get to that 2030 target by about 2031 or 2032. So we're not quite there, but we're certainly closer than we would be without the new work that has been identified in this roadmap. So that's the impetus for the work. It's what we can hope to achieve with the actions identified in the roadmap. And so the last thing that I want to do is talk a bit about the near-term actions identified in the roadmap that will implicate the oil and gas sector. As I noted, the roadmap covers all sectors of the economy. But for the purposes of this commission, I want to focus just on those items that affect oil and gas. If you're interested on these near-term actions, I encourage you to take a close look at the updated roadmap. I'll also note that we are looking forward to working with the commission to implement these actions over the coming years, and we'll certainly rely on the expertise of this commission to help achieve this work. So the first near-term action related to oil and gas is to continue the implementation of CDPHE's intensity requirements. Those rules began for new operations in January of 2023, will take effect for existing operations in January of 2025. And so CDPHE will lead the continued implementation of those rules and enforcement to achieve the emissions reduction estimates that we expect from that rule. The second near-term action included in the roadmap is for ECMC and CDPHE to develop a framework for operators to achieve net greenhouse gas neutral oil and gas operations, with a goal for all new operations to be net GHG neutral by 2040. And operators could meet that target through a variety of actions, including carbon capture, plugging and abandoning existing wells, purchasing offsets. The details of that will need to be worked out by this commission in partnership with CDPHE. The third near-term action here is for ECMC and CDPHE to provide additional incentives for operators to plug existing wells and retire production facilities. And this could work in concert with the item that I previously mentioned. The fourth action here is for ECMC to begin to track emissions from truck trips associated with oil and gas operations, and then consider measures to begin reducing those emissions from truck traffic. And then finally, the roadmap directs ECMT to study alternative uses of oil and gas infrastructure, including using that infrastructure for geothermal energy production, for biogenic hydrogen production, for gravity-based energy storage, for carbon sequestration. There's a whole host of potential uses. And so the roadmap directs ECMC to begin to study what those uses are and how existing infrastructure might accommodate new uses. I'll also note that while I'm not highlighting it in this presentation, the roadmap also includes direction to ECMC to continue its work in other areas that will contribute to emissions reductions. That includes work on carbon management and hydrogen development, and there's direction in the roadmap to ECMC to continue work in those areas as well. And as I mentioned, we are looking forward to working with this commission, with stakeholders and our colleagues in other state agencies to begin implementing the near-term actions identified in the roadmap. I'll note that the roadmap provides high-level policy direction, but we're going to rely on the expertise of this commission and ECMC staff to consider how to implement this direction. We're also going to rely on extensive engagement with interested stakeholders to inform the ultimate implementation of these actions. We don't have all of the details figured out in the roadmap. We've identified some goals that we're trying to achieve, but there's lots of work that will need to be done to determine how to implement these actions effectively and efficiently. And so finally, I just want to recognize again the hard work of ECMC and other state agency staff and stakeholders who contributed to the updated roadmap. We're excited that it's finally out. Now the hard work of actually implementing it begins. And I'll thank you for the time and would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, Commissioner Ray, I've got a question. I wonder if we could go back to the slide on the kind of the baseline scenarios and I just want to make sure that I understand the graphic here. And so the strategies that were implemented in 1.0 are really that's the yellow line. Is that right? And then the new strategies, once implemented, would indicate the green line.
That's right.
And there would be a 3.0 at some point that would continue down the star line, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an important one. So the goal of these near-term actions were to identify things that could be implemented over the next 2 to 3 years. So basically by 2026 to at least have begun implementation. And we think that if we achieve that, that will get us closer to our 2030 target. But you'll notice, as you point out, under all these scenarios, we're not meeting our 2035 or 2040 or 2050 targets. We know that more work will be necessary. And so we expect that in some number of years, we will come back, update this roadmap again, identify new actions that will need to be taken so that we can meet those statutory targets. I'll also note that none of these things are happening in a vacuum. The state is doing everything that we can do within our jurisdiction and control, but certainly actions at the federal level have real implications. And so these scenarios include those major recent federal actions. And not only will Colorado need to take additional action to meet our goals, we would certainly expect there'll be additional federal action as well in the future that we're not modeling here. So the real task was, let's see how we can get to 2030, and then we're going to have to come back and figure out how do we get to 2035.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And then I note it's not on the slides associated with ECMC, but I do note that it's in some of the strategies in the Greenhouse Gas Roadmap 2.0, but coal mine methane capture and either utilization or beneficial use. How does that being contemplated? I mean, I've worked on this, and you and I have talked about this, but worked on this in a previous life. Is that being contemplated as a task for DRMS or CEO, or do we have a role to play in that, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. As I noted, there's other actions that will require work from ECMC that I didn't include in this presentation, but as you point out, one of those is identifying ways to capture additional methane, either natural methane seepage or methane from landfills and other sources. Methane from coal mines is one of those items that's called out in the roadmap. We would anticipate that that will involve collaboration between DNR's Division of Reclamation and Mining Safety, who regulates coal mine activity. There's likely a role for ECMC in that work, and there'll likely be a role for CDPHE as well. So as we start implementing that direction, I would expect at least those three state agencies to work together to figure out what opportunities exist within existing authority, and then what additional legislative or regulatory action might be needed if we need to take action beyond what we can do within existing authority. So that's definitely going to be a cross-cutting action with multiple state agencies, likely including ECMC playing a role.
Great. Thanks for that, and thanks for presenting today. I think the chair is predisposed, and so does any other commissioners have questions for Commissioner Ray? Go ahead, Karen. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Sub-Chair. Mr. Ray, thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering if you could maybe flip to the net zero emissions for oil and gas operators, and do we mean as an operator overall with all of its operations, or do we mean individually as they're submitting OGDP applications, or is this TBD? I'm kind of curious to know kind of where we might be heading with this and how we might be thinking about tackling it.
Yeah, Commissioner McGowan, thanks for the question. Ultimately, that's going to be something that this commission, along with CDPHE, will need to work through. I will note that as we were developing this item and received feedback on this item from stakeholders, including the oil and gas industry, one of the pieces of feedback that we received is that it would be challenging or could be challenging for an operator to make an individual OGDP net GHG neutral, but that if you spread that work across an operator's portfolio, there become opportunities to get closer to that net GHG neutral target. And so we tried to leave some flexibility for the commission in determining how to implement this so that we could work with operators to determine what's feasible to meet those targets. So it could be on an OGDP level, it could be across an operator's full portfolio. The other thing that I'll note here that we talked about, and again, all of this is to be determined, but that we wanted this to be flexible enough to accommodate retrofit of existing facilities as well as new facilities. That's not worked out in any detail, but we want to provide as much flexibility as possible to enable operators to meet these targets. But we'll rely on this commission and work with stakeholders to figure out those details.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Other commissioners with questions? Well, thanks, Commissioner Ray. Any closing comments or?
No, just thank you for the questions. They're good ones. Thanks for the engagement over this process, and looking forward to working with you all as we try to figure out how to implement this direction. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Commissioners, we've got a scheduled break at 10:30, so let's go ahead and take that and then come back at 10:35.
All right, we're back. Apologies, I got called out from the meeting for a bit. Back here now. We will move on to our next element of our proceeding, which is the staff presentation on the Cumulative Impacts Annual Report. Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm working on presenting for the first time from a computer with multiple screens in a while. So bear with me as I get a little bit oriented and get us all queued up. Hopefully everybody has that up and running now and can see the PowerPoint and only the PowerPoint.
That's good.
Great, awesome. I want to start with saying I'm, thrilled to provide the third annual report on the evaluation of cumulative impacts. As let's find my cursor here. I just wanted to orient folks a little bit on this because I think this year is a particularly significant milestone in this process. We adopted rules in 2020 that contemplated gathering data annually, beginning in 2021, to start to understand what impacts we were seeing, both beneficial and impact reductions, and then provide us the space as a commission to iterate in response to that. And so this third report, we can actually start to see 3 data points that start to look more like trends than anomalies or outliers. And I think that more than anything for me, the framework of this report and what we're starting to see in it is the framework that this commission designed 3.5 years ago is working as it was designed. We can start to see places where we can take action. It has also driven conversations between ECMC and CDPHE about data collection, data management that are outside of the traditional policy or regulatory purview, but firmly within how we provide the best customer service as state agencies. So I think that just at the highest level, I'm thrilled to start to see that the framework is designed as working and starts to provide information back to us that is actionable, conversations that are actionable, and how we can continue to refine, iterate, and improve how we do our jobs. When you have the chance to look through it, it is a robust, detailed document with lots of graphics as well to help those of us who are better at visually than reading. I'm going to focus on a couple of high points. I'm thrilled that Aaron has already covered the greenhouse gas piece in so much detail, so I'll be lighter on that than I might have otherwise been. And of course, the place where I need to start these comments is with such a great deal of thanks to staff for their work that has gone into this. As many of you know, we have also started building out a cumulative impacts team led by Sabrina Trask, and I would look forward to her making this presentation next year as she finds her stride and really continues to advance the work of our agency in this organization. I also have to express deep gratitude for our partners at Air Pollution Control Division, Powder Energy Office, CPW, and others who have really contributed to the depth and granularity and information provided in this report and on a go-forward basis. So with that, I'll jump into a little bit more of the detail. As I noted, this is our third year of reporting, which means we're starting to see 3 years of data in some arenas that help us start to understand trajectories. Are we at a horizontal? Are we not changing? Are we increasing? Are we decreasing? In addition, this year we have more information that allows us to compare estimates, especially of air quality data, to the actual emissions and start to understand, did the plans as they came into the commission overestimate impacts or underestimate impacts? And what does that mean? And how can we dig into that data and continue to get better estimates, continue to get better outcomes in the long run? So I'll get into that a little bit more. Also, this is the second year where we've had high priority habitat data to work on and to start to look at year-over-year wildlife impacts, and that will continue to grow over time as the rule is designed. And also in 2023, CPW, or Colorado Parks and Wildlife, initiated projects that use the compensatory mitigation funds associated with the OGDPs. So we're starting again to get report outs of these information. And so again, it does take time to build a data set. It takes time to build a program, and it takes time for that program to start to provide information back to us. But I'm thrilled to say that here at the beginning of 2024, work that we finalized at the end of 2020 and came into effect beginning of 2021 is starting to really shine in that way. So let's talk a little bit about cumulative impacts protections. And I think that one of the interesting things to look at is a reduction in approved wells, reduction in approved locations. And I think what this on balance reflects to me, you know, there's a piece that we're not seeing OGDP with oil and gas locations proposed within a mile of high occupancy building units. That is a change from before, you know, Senate Bill 19-181 rules went into effect. But we've also seen an increase in the protectiveness, if you will, or operate of applications for oil and gas development, for example, or to be more precise, what operators are submitting is taking the information that we're gleaning and asking them to look at and putting together more protective plans, citing it outside of sensitive receptors, being mindful about how to, you know, apply the mitigation hierarchy of avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating. And so I think on balance, you know, we're seeing a reduced impact from new oil and gas development as we compared it to year over year. Jumping in now to some of the more granular data. So this is our a summary of data collected in our CIDR database, our cumulative impacts data repository. And it looks at the total number of OGDPs approved in 2023. The figure 2 is looking at the raw number of oil and gas development plans. And as a quick orientation and reminder, an oil and gas development plan can propose one or more oil and gas locations. And so I wanted a slide to take a look at both oil and gas development plans and also the specific locations, because the locations are the ones that are actually where a site is being constructed, where the wells are being drilled, and trying to understand what that statewide distribution looks like. Throughout the rest of this presentation and in the report itself, you will see these colors to the extent for those of you who are really good at color, it'll be easier. For those of you that struggle with color, we'll find a better way to present it next year. That reflect, again, this kind of distribution across the state from the Eastern Plains, Front Range, Southeast Plains, Southwest Slope, and then the West Slope. Again, the lion's share of the development, both from OGDPs submitted as well as locations submitted, is on the Front Range. There were 45 oil and gas development plans that were approved in 2023, and those are associated with 71 oil and gas locations. I would note that the Southeast Plains, the 13 locations approved in the Southeast Plains, are all helium, just to remember that, you know, we do have different commodities being developed. And so now I will get into a couple of the other examples of the data sets that are being collected and reflected in this year's report. I would note that I forgot to note at the outset that the report will be available later today along with this presentation for the public and will be distributed to our stakeholders. So jumping into the water use. So in previous reports, we've presented estimates for water use per well on the Form 2B, which again is the form that collects cumulative impacts information in estimates as part of our CIDR database. which is figure 7 on the left here. There were 11 locations, but this year there were 11 locations that had Form 5 and 5A, which is our drilling and completion reports. So what actually happened with the well as it was drilled and completed for all the wells on the location. So we're really looking at those subset of 11 locations. And figure 11 on the right shows that these 11 locations generally underestimated the water used on these locations. And so that's, not the favorite data that we want to see, but it's important to know so we can help calibrate what those estimates are. And so there are some other trends that are really positive coming out of the report, but I don't want to only report on the good things, right? So I did want to flag that there is a differential on the Front Range in particular around the estimated water use versus actual water use. In that regard, I think that this is really important as we're continuing the work and supporting the work of the Produced Water Consortium in the Department of Natural Resources Executive Director's Office. Again, we start gathering data and we start understanding what it means, and we can start evolving and adjusting policy in accordance with it. But I think this is an important first step. We look to continue to refine this going forward, and again, working with the consortium on a number of those pieces. The next example I'm going to jump into is on the DI community component. I think this continues to be an incredibly important part of Colorado's conversation in how we can improve how the state operates in protecting disproportionately impacted communities. So far, I think that the data that we're collecting and the operations being both proposed and approved are largely outside of disproportionately impacted community. And I think that is a good trend and something that we should focus on. In addition to that, we also want to be cognizant of all humans in the state at times. And so I also pulled figure 57 to take a look at how many oil and gas locations are being approved within 1 mile of a residential building unit or an RBU. And I think that we're starting to see, we're not starting to see, but we're seeing a heavy focus on siting outside of or away from residential building units. I think that this is really good and a good thing to track over time to make sure that we're continuing to be mindful of proximity of oil and gas to people. And I'll jump now to the next slide. Again, I probably should have warned everybody that this is a bit of a smattering of approaches, right? Let's talk about water, let's talk about DI communities, let's talk about wildlife there, and we'll close out with some air conversations. But that's really the breadth of the report, and there's so much more detail in it. So now looking at wildlife, again, this is the first time we have a year-over-year into high priority habitat data. We're seeing an overall decrease, we think, in the overall impacts per well to high priority habitats. Again, there's been a great deal of collaboration with Colorado Parks and Wildlife on the requirements for compensatory mitigation and to ensure a thorough review of these OGDPs. So again, we're only 2 years into this. It's hard to make assumptions about trends with 2 data points, but next year I think we'll start to have a better feel and better information about wildlife that can continue to calibrate how we are managing, responding, and collaborating with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Now jumping into one of the most complicated topics, I think, in Colorado right now as it relates to oil and gas development. I would remind all of us that last March, Governor Polis issued a directive to ECMC and Air Pollution Control Division and the Air Quality Control Commission to reduce NOx emissions from the oil and gas sector with specific targets. And that continues to be, a key conversation in our ongoing cumulative impacts discussion and rulemaking. That rulemaking, I would note, is formally underway at this point in time, as we noticed it recently and scheduled for a late April hearing dates. So I think that this is good background information for that conversation, certainly. And a look at estimated emissions from approved OGDPs is something we've been monitoring closely and working very closely with Air Pollution Control Division to understand and continue to improve. I think it's important to note that the OGDPs approved in 2023 had a lower statewide NOx emission per well as estimated across the life cycle of development. So I think that that's a good thing to note as we're thinking about how to continue to reduce those NOx emissions. And I think that they really demonstrate the hard work between us, APCD, to start the work on NOx reductions that will be enhanced both through APCD's recent rulemaking on NOx emissions and the NOx intensity, as well as our work through the cumulative impacts rulemaking. You know, I look forward to the outcomes of that rulemaking to help continue to advance this conversation, and again, continue to have the benefit of this report to understand both estimates and then using information submitted to APCD, the actuals on these topics. So jumping now from NOx to methane emissions, I think Aaron covered this, or Commissioner Ray covered this very nicely in talking about the greenhouse gas 2.0 roadmap. But again, we're seeing reductions in the per well methane emissions, which again is a signal that the work that we as a state started in 2014 and continue to advance through APCD's greenhouse gas intensity rulemaking of 18 months ago or so, is continuing to work. Our commitment to reducing routine venting and flaring and monitoring for leaks is making demonstrable progress. This is the first time we've had data about it to be able to quantify the impact of regulatory programs versus an understanding that they're working. So I think it's bearing fruit is the long story short on methane emissions as well. And that is also reflected in the roadmap update. So those are pieces that are collected pursuant to CIDR and specifically required pursuant to 904. I would note that 904 creates an opportunity for commissioners to request in advance of the report being finalized, you know, other things, other pieces that we should be looking into as part of this report. And one of those is kind of the statewide well activity question. And this was requested by commissioners, I think in 2022 maybe, or 21. I think 22 was the first year we started looking at it. In 2023, we continued the trend in Colorado of plugging more wells than were spud. And for those of you who, quick reminder, spud means the well was started. The drill bit touched the earth and started moving in that regard. So again, I think that this is an important trend from any number of standpoints because it signals that one, we are actually, you know, plugging more wells than we are drilling, which reduces the surface impact of oil and gas development in Colorado. It also means that operators, and again, this is largely operator driven, not orphan well program driven, operators are returning surface to the landowners, to the local government for future uses, removing older equipment and technologies that are not as efficient. And so on balance, I think that continuing to monitor what our statewide well activity looks like is important. I would note that, you know, in my 10 years or so working with this commission, the high point of the wells that remained to be plugged in Colorado was roughly 57,000. We're down to about 48,000 now, which is a pretty significant reduction. We've largely maintained the same production level, which is a really interesting piece of data, right? Like we're reducing well counts, but maintaining production, which means our wells are more efficient. But we're reducing that overall surface impact to Colorado. And that work is driven largely by industry plugging, not our orphan well program. Or, you know, we have, you know, less than 1,000 orphan wells in Colorado. So the 10,000 or so wells that have been plugged in my tenure here are being plugged by industry itself. We have embedded important regulatory requirements to help encourage that, but just kind of wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about statewide well activity. And our cumulative impacts report, it could not be completed without the enormous contributions from our partners at the Air Pollution Control Division, and their expertise, their data, and their level of detail and understanding of how this is going. There is so much information in this report that has been compiled by and supported by our partners at APCD, and many of our partners at Colorado Energy Office also were major contributors. These sections summarize many of the reports that have been published by the Air Pollution Control Division and the Energy Office and recap a number of the presentations given to the Commission, but this is really I think the report really helps pull together how these three different organizations are working together to achieve the overarching goals of Colorado. And I'm sure that most of the information in any of these sections or all of them could be a separate presentation in and of itself as commissioners are diving into these different topics. And if there is something that's worth having a separate presentation, let's talk about it. But I would just note that there's a ton of information in this report, and wanted to, again, probably at this point, rehash what Aaron presented earlier about the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Again, the oil and gas sector is projected to exceed its targets for 2025 and 2020, or 2025 and 2030 emission reductions. And again, our organization, ECMC, and the APCD remain key agencies in working to update the roadmap and continue to engage in the further emission reductions necessary to ensure that this sector is meeting its greenhouse gas targets. Again, APCD has a much broader vantage point or regulatory scope, but for our purposes, really focusing on emissions reductions from the oil and gas sector. So that is kind of a quick recap of a very few of the many reports and detailed information in the cumulative impact reports. I wanted to talk a little bit about future reports, and again, really kind of starting to close where I started, which is the framework that was designed is working. And as evidence of that, I wanted to talk about some of the pieces, right? How are we adapting based on the information that we have? You know, we've come a long way in evaluating cumulative impacts or potential for cumulative impacts, and we certainly have more work ahead. And I think that we are going to be making changes in the short term to the Form 2B, which collects the cumulative impacts data, right? We have a better understanding of how it's working. We have a better understanding of what information we need from it. And we're continuing to focus on how we partner with the Air Pollution Control Division on air data collection in particular. So staff has identified some of these changes, which are in a previous report. We also anticipate additional changes as part of the cumulative impacts rulemaking, right? Like, how are we doing this better together? How are we gathering data? What's important to our stakeholders, and what really is the outcome from the commissioners about what data we need to collect and how we need to collect it. So once the full suite of those changes is understood, we will be updating the form. We've started some of that work now, recognizing that there are some pieces that may be separate from the outcome of the cumulative impacts rulemaking that need to change as well. And so, you know, I think, as I noted on the water issue, that's an opportunity for us to continue to really dig in and understand the difference between estimates to actuals. And so we want to make sure and take a harder look at the estimates that are coming into the commission and understand if they are being properly estimated and what's going on. And as I noted, you know, we stood up our cumulative impacts and regulatory affairs unit led by Sabrina Trask. But this unit is really integral to this interrelationship across so many different organizations, so many different data sets. And again, understanding the landscape level view of the potential for cumulative impacts from oil and gas development in Colorado. So Sabrina and her team will be absolutely instrumental in how we continue to use our data around cumulative impacts to inform policy choices, to inform operational choices, and to inform how we can continue to process and improve. I would note we're in the process of hiring a cumulative impacts data specialist to help us achieve that vision, and always on the internal side of what I do, spending a lot of time thinking about how to best equip this team for success, given the myriad of asks related to it. So a couple, those are important kind of changes. And then a couple of, you know, closing thoughts from me. Again, I can't echo my thanks enough to the folks who have been such huge contributors to this report. QA/QCing data, making sure we understand what everything looks like, how everything comes together. It's an enormous lift for our partners at the Air Pollution Control Division to help integrate this data into our work as well. But I think most importantly, this year, we really see that this report is part of a continuous feedback loop and a broader effort to evaluate and address the potential for cumulative impacts. It is a comprehensive report with a ton of information, so I hope everybody can take some time to dig through it. It certainly took me 2 or 3 passes to really distill down and glean the information available. Again, that report will be available on our website later today. And I think that most important as we look to the future, this report is not the end. It's driving this feedback loop of process improvement. It is going to be, I think, a critical component in conversation of our upcoming cumulative impacts rulemaking, how we collect the data, how we evaluate it, and how we act upon it. Again, our work with our partners at the Air Pollution Control Division is only going to continue to deepen as we're working through achieving both NOx and greenhouse gas targets, and working together in that space to not to be hitched together successfully and to not recreate each other's expertise. So really looking forward to how this conversation continues to unfold in the coming months, especially I know historically or in the last couple of years, staff has presented this report to the commission and then set aside time later on for folks to have a conversation about it. I think that continues to be an appropriate process, but would defer to the 7 of you to continue to work through how we can answer questions, engage, or further refine how we are preparing and presenting this report, and also recognizing how the upcoming rulemaking will continue to influence next year's report. And with that, Chair, I would conclude my remarks and happy to take questions.
Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. I appreciate that. This is helpful, and I think it's good to see some of the progress being made. One of the questions that stuck out to me, and maybe I'm missing something in looking at it, the water estimate versus actual use was one of the things that stuck out as something we definitely need to work on. But I don't know if I caught in there the difference between water usage on a per well basis in 2023 versus 2022. Do you have that information?
Let me pull up. Let me reshare. Okay, hopefully we're back into the presentation.
Yes.
So if you look at I think your question is specifically about estimated to actuals or just estimated?
So what I'm seeing here is we have the difference in estimates between 21, 22, and 23.
Yep.
But in the estimated versus actual, it looks like we're just looking at 2023. So I'm kind of curious, were the estimates that far off in 2022? Was the usage increased? Was the usage decreased? Just kind of curious as in the actuals that we get, what the difference.
So we are just now getting actual water data in.
Okay.
Due to the regulatory lag, right? And so stuff approved in 21, we need to get all of the completions for the wells on a particular location. And so we had 11 of those completed in 2023. And so this is our first year of actuals.
Got it. Okay.
So next year, I'm really looking forward to that conversation next year.
That explanation is helpful. Thank you.
Other questions, Commissioner Messner?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Director Murphy, appreciate the presentation. From my opinion, the presentation itself brought up a ton of questions for me, as I'm sure the cumulative impacts report will, once I get a chance to read it. And so I wonder if we could schedule something, maybe a week or two from now, once we have a chance to read the report, to do a work session or put some time aside for us to be able to ask questions. I hate to go down rabbit holes on stuff that you presented today, without having fully read and absorbed the report itself. And so I think that would be helpful to be able to do that in a week or two, and then also do a follow-up maybe in a month or two to start looking at things that we may want to see incorporated in future cumulative impacts reports, because I'm sure that as soon as this one gets done, the next one begins getting developed. So
Thank
Dr.
you.
Murphy?
Oh, thanks. I'm forgetting all the protocols. Thank you, Commissioner Mesner. I will work with Mr. Peskin on getting those conversations scheduled, because I agree that those are important components as well. And thinking about one just kind of focused on conversations around the report, and the second one focused a little bit more on the intersection with rulemaking. We may want to think about how to fold that more formally into the rulemaking conversation too.
sure.
I'll work with AAGs on that too.
Other questions at this point for the director? All right, well, I think we're all looking forward to spending some time with the report, developing up some questions, and then having a dialogue with you, Director Murphy, and some of your team here in a few weeks. All right, that concludes the Cumulative Impacts Annual Report. Now we will turn to the last docket that we have today. That is docket 231-000-321. This is an enforcement matter involving Petroglyph Operating Company. Do we have any form of a presentation from our hearings officer or the AGs on this matter? Ms. Ward.
Yes, hello. I will be sharing my screen if you're all ready.
Yeah, and before you do that, Ms. Ward, let me just sort of make a call out to the attendees. If anyone is in attendance who is either a person that's associated with Petroglyph Operating Company or an attorney that represents Petroglyph Operating Company, please raise your hand and we will elevate you to the panel. And with that, Ms. Ward, with that notice to Petroglyph, we'll see if anyone shows up, but you can go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And are you seeing the presentation?
Yeah.
Great. So good morning, Commission. My name is Tessa Ward, and I'm an Assistant Attorney General representing ECMC staff. Today, staff is requesting that the Commission enter Order Finding Violation 913 against Petroglyph Operating Company, which I will refer to as Petroglyph. Petroglyph is the operator of record for 2 locations in Huerfano County, State 7W and State 9W. Both of these locations involve the State Land Board, and we've been in contact with their counsel accordingly. All wells associated with these locations were plugged and abandoned either in 2011 or 2012. Importantly, staff initially found violations of Rules 1002F and 1004E at both of these sites in 2016, and in 2017, the Commission approved an Administrative Order of Consent, or AOC, requiring Petroglyph to come into compliance with those 2 rules. However, when numerous follow-up inspections revealed that the 2 sites remained in violation of both rules, staff also found a Rule 523 violation for violating the AOC itself. I won't delve too deeply into this, but we did think it was important to note that when Petroglyph's general partner, Exploration, filed for bankruptcy in 2016, the court approved a settlement between Exploration and Petroglyph, where the parties explicitly agreed to fund on a joint and several basis all costs in connection with remediating the Colorado leases. And those proceedings were closed in 2019. On April 21st, 2023, staff issued notices of alleged violation after finding Petroglyph in violations of Rules 1002F, 1004E, and 523F at both sites, totaling 6 violations overall. On November 7th, 2023, staff issued a notice and application for a hearing to Petroglyph through certified mail, and also published notice in the required newspapers of general circulation. Turning now to Rule 1002F2, this rule requires that operator implement and maintain BMPs to control stormwater runoff in a manner that minimizes erosion, transport of sediment off-site, and site degradation until final reclamation is achieved. Here, the 2017 AOC required Petroglyph to come into compliance with this rule. However, when staff conducted multiple follow-up inspections after 2017, each time they observed that Petroglyph had not taken the required corrective actions and that erosion and degradation indeed persisted. And here we have some photos of just a couple of inspections, although there were several more. First, we have state 7W and then 9W. Next, Rule 1004E requires that all areas being reclaimed shall be kept as free as practicable of all undesirable plant species designated to be noxious weeds. It also specifies that it is the responsibility of the operator to monitor affected and reclaimed lands for noxious weeds. Similarly, here, the 2017 AOC required Petroglyph to come into compliance with this rule and maintain ongoing weed control until final reclamation inspection is passed. But when staff found Petroglyph still in violation at follow-up inspections throughout 2020 all the way until 2022. And again, we have some photos of just two of the inspections, starting with 7W and then 9W. And lastly, under Rule 523F, an operator's failure to diligently implement corrective action pursuant to an AOC constitutes an independent violation because numerous inspections after the 2017 AOC found violations of both 1004E and 1002F at both sites. The NOAVs issued in April of 2023 also found that Petroglyph violated 523F. As you can see, Petroglyph has a total of $60,000 in financial assurance. Their surety provider is Fidelity and Deposit Company of Maryland. Fidelity received a notice and application of hearing through certified mail, and as a result, we've been in contact with Surety's counsel throughout this matter. Therefore, enforcement staff requests that this commission issue order finding violation 913, finding Petroglyph in violation of rules 1004E, 1002F, and 523F, and further require Petroglyph to pay the penalty of $2,389,700 within 35 days of this commission implementing the order. Enforcement staff would also request that the order include requirements that if Petroglyph does not come into compliance or pay the penalty within 35 days, the director shall suspend operators' Form 10s, terminate their operator number, rescind their Form 1, revoke their authorization to conduct oil and gas operations in Colorado, foreclose their financial assurance, and require Petroglyph to come into compliance with the order and repay any funds expended by the commission from the ECMC cash fund. And lastly, enforcement staff would also request that the order authorize the director to declare any of Petroglyph's wells orphaned wells. And with that, I will leave it for questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. At this time, commissioners, we can ask questions of Ms. Ward. If we have questions, I note for the record that no one as a representative of Petroglyph and or no attorney representing Petroglyph has appeared before us. So this is somewhat in the manner of a default action in which we would or have the, since this has been noticed for hearing, we have the ability to take the recommended action as indicated by Ms. Ward. Does anyone have questions before we move to a motion? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Ms. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Ward, for the presentation. Can you, do you, off the top of your head, know if Petroglyph cannot pay the penalty, does not pay the penalty, and their wells are declared orphaned, how many wells do they have? Do they have any wells in production? How many might be transferred to the orphan well fund, or are they all, are we talking about issues with final reclamation?
I might defer to AAG Schultz here. It's my understanding that they don't have any wells in production and that all of their wells have been plugged and abandoned, period.
I concur. I agree.
Okay, thank you. And this is financial assurance under old rules that we are recouping, not current.
Correct. They have not come to the table on the new financial assurance rules.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? All right, do we have a motion?
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Ackerman?
I'll move to approve staff recommendation.
Second.
AAG Davenport, is that sufficient for our record?
Mr. Chair, that's fine. I understand the motion to be to approve the order as presented by staff, and that's fine.
Okay. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Ward. Thank you, Mr. Schultz, for the presentation and bringing this matter before us today.
Thank you.
All right. On my docket, we have concluded our business for today. I want to thank everybody for participating with us and listening in. I encourage everyone to go read the cumulative impacts report. We'll have a question and answer session on that in a few weeks. And with that, look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor of the motion to adjourn signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We will see you next week. Thanks, folks.